Hello, all, and this is the last talk in our session and the last talk of our symposium. And it's a pleasure to introduce to you a gentleman that you may not know, because Dr. Tim Eastman is not directly involved in parapsychology, but he is directly interested in it from his work. So Timothy Eastman is a physicist, and he received his doctorate in physics and also geophysics from the University of Alaska, and has worked in his professional life as in space physics, plasma physics, and remarkably, I guess became is a good way to say it, became a philosopher by a long-standing interest since his childhood, and has made remarkable contributions to discussions about what kind of framework might we have in order to understand the world. And in particular, he has recently published his book, which I guess this does come out in reverse mirror, but Untying the Gordian Knot, Process, Reality, and Context, which is an extremely interesting synthesis of years of study from in philosophy and physics and dynamical systems, complex systems theory, and how these all might come together to give us a chance of understanding some of the numinous aspects of the world, as well as the actual evident parts of it and how these may come together. So you can see that we do have some themes that are repeating in different forms throughout the symposium, things of splits that find some unification, and of positing new sort of ontological possibilities as a way of finding a symmetry that, when it's cracked open and broken, reveals all the wild and woolly nature of our world. So with that, I would like to invite you, Tim, who is going to, as Ed did, speak without slides. I should just say just one word is how Tim actually got here, was that his book was presented on the internet in a series of exchanges between himself and other philosophers over the course of last year. And there's an institute, the Cobb Institute, which is interested in Whiteheadian philosophy, hosted a series of lectures, which is available online. And I had looked at those, and Ed Kelly actually was involved in that, in exchanges with Tim. And when I was really, as I was thinking about putting this symposium together, I was fascinated by Tim's view, and I kind of got Ed to make an introduction and cold called Tim, who remarkably said, sure, he would love to join us and present. So maybe the message of Tim's presence here is that we are not alone, and that there are others who also grapple with these kind of deep questions. So with that, Tim, please.
Well, thank you, Peter, for your introduction. I had thought about doing some slides earlier, but then I radically changed how I was going to present this in the last couple of days. So here it is, just verbally and without slides. And Ed concluded with this, well, just recently in this discussion, reference to dualism and how do we understand that, and also notions of idealism and realism. So I struggled with those issues similarly. I come to so to speak think that there's dualities in our experience inevitably, but I think eventually we can get to a point of seeing dualities without dualism. Certainly not the Descartes form of it mentioned earlier. And so I'm inspired especially by works in quantum physics, but also systems theory, semiotics, information theory, and so forth. And in and especially there's a book, Knowledge and Time by Hans Primus, that was enabled after Primus's untimely death, well, age 86 in 2014. And then Harold Ottmansbacher enabled the completion of that in 2017, Knowledge and Time. And in the first 3 to 4 chapters, he articulates a very nice discussion of what's called Boolean logic and non-Boolean logic. Boolean logic being a way of framing the actualizations of things into particular space-time discrete yes or no patterns that of actualization such that that the spin of the electron is discretely up or down. The state of the electronic circuit is either yes or no. A discrete logic that's called a Boolean logic. But then I came to realize that there were several approaches to understanding quantum physics that fundamentally introduced both a Boolean logic of actualization and a non-Boolean logic of possibilism. And this has been mentioned earlier, Ruth Kastner in particular, building on John Kramer's transactional approach or transactional interpretation in quantum physics. Ruth Kastner, a student of Jeff Boobs, who in turn was a student of Bohm, then she's introduced and articulated very well a possibilist interpretation of quantum physics. So has Michael Epperson and Elias de Vries, and so has Stuart Kauffman, and you might say as well as Henry Stapp, and even you might say Werner Heisenberg, a great founder of quantum physics, in a work in 1958. And indeed, I think there's been a certain confluence in recent years to a certain possibilist interpretation of quantum physics. And while the implications of this are substantial, that is that the notion of, say, a many world interpretation or multiverse that you might have heard is a form of actualism, insisting that the propositions we have, the best of propositions, are always referred to particular outputs, particular localized space-time data, things that you can put in spreadsheets and manipulate in that way. Things that you can, data that you can then enter as input for your formalism, your equations, to then make enable a solution, a prediction. And certainly the goal of science is to achieve mathematical forms that represent a context-independent framing such that the formalism, the equation, can work on planet Earth or Andromeda or anywhere else in the universe. But inevitably, in addition to that way of context independence, which is, so to speak, a goal of science, is inevitably an aspect of context, that is the introduction of initial conditions and boundary conditions to make possible particular solutions. And I would say also a third way of knowing, referring to ultimate context. So 3 ways of framing our approaches to knowing: context independence, context attention or focus, and ultimate context. Now, in the focus on actualism, actual space-time discrete output results or data, then that we can put in spreadsheets, these are always set up, so to speak, in a immediate local setting. And then the question is, what is the relationship of that local setting to a more inclusive global context? And I would say that in every case, that there's always not just a matter of an input-output, there's always the issue of a triadic, an input-output context. And that, so to speak, that triadic, it's like a semiotic relation. It's fundamental. It's radically fundamental. And that's true of all physics, all science, and so forth. But often as an approximation, we neglect the context. We focus on the input-output only. We focus just on the discrete solvability of a particular equation and its direct application to output variables. Well, this is quite limited because let's make the analog here. And this analog is suggested by Hans Primus in his book, Knowledge and Time, the 3rd chapter. An analog is consider the cartographic map projections, like the like the type of math projection of the surface of the Earth that we use in our standard maps of a particular state or a particular country. Then, and so locally, the map helps us a lot with driving from place to place. But if you look more globally, you recognize that Mercator projection or whatever projection we're using is distortive of the overall curvature of the Earth. You force it into a flat surface in this map projection. And so locally, the Earth is the Earth locally, the Earth's surface can be approximated as flat, but it's not absolutely flat. It's an approximation. And consider how we can effectively use such maps in a very functional way, and yet we recognize that the Earth globally is a spherical whole when viewed as a whole. So the analog here is that think of that local versus global, likewise to the usage of a actualized or sets of actualizations and an algebra or a logic of actualizations, a Boolean algebra, being, so to speak, the local description of systems and processes in the quantum physics. And that contrasts with a more global description that has to accommodate both the actualized description and a possibilistic description of possible interactions and transactions, a non-Boolean description. So the Boolean and the non-Boolean, the actual and the possible, are analogous to the local and the global in the cartographic description. This is, so to speak, the analog. Now, if one is insistent on posing, thinking in terms of simply actualism in enforcing that upon the system, then that's so to speak, taking the more complex inclusive system of both the actual and the possible, the Boolean and the non-Boolean, and insisting that actualized space-time description is the ultimate way to represent all propositions. Well, that's physicalism. And if we further reduce that to saying that can't be even both the Boolean and the non-Boolean, but strictly Boolean proposition only, actualized Boolean description, that's the end of the story, then that's scientism. And these are not, these are very useful approximations in the science, but when you force fit it down to maybe a claim of the real world inclusively, then that's from the point of view, my point of view, that's obviously false. That you're imposing a philosophic interpretation of a certain peculiar type on the nature of reality. To me, reality is both the actual and the possible, both the Boolean and the non-Boolean logical framing, both the subject and the objective, both symmetry and asymmetry, both the local and the global, both external and internal relations. That's the science we're coming to now in contemporary quantum physics, and these new possibilist interpretations that I think are so important are coming to this kind of more inclusive framing. And often, even though, for example, classical mechanics that was referred to by Ed has been very powerful and very effective, it's a great approximation to the fundamental quantum physics and so forth, and it's enabled us, with only some exception, classical mechanics provided 98% of the means by which we could go to the moon and back in terms of, it represents a very good approximation. You can do orbital trajectories and a lot of space physics with that by itself, the basic classical mechanics. And then with quantum mechanics, in the quantum mechanics, QM, we focus on the more local descriptions and more local aspects of things and focus on simple input-output. That's very powerful. But the full quantum physics and quantum field theory is more inclusive and accommodates fully both the actual and the possible, as I see it. But often we simply presume that space-time, material particles in space-time is somehow the that the efficacy of it, the the power of it in classical mechanics or more simple quantum mechanics has been so powerful that we somehow think that a materialist description of the multiplicity of things in disjunction in particular space-time location is a sufficient description of everything. That so to speak is materialism. But you see, that can't possibly be, because in quantum field theory, which is yet more fundamental, there's no direct reference to the time parameter. It's only implicit. So that what's represented, I think, in quantum field theory, the most fundamental of theory, is a mapping to the sequence of one fundamental process after the other, a succession, a fundamental succession. And out of this fundamental succession, which is the grounding of the world everywhere, out of this fundamental succession is the emergence of temporality and of spatial relation and of space-time description. So to presume that the space-time metric description, the space-time plus matter description of materialism is somehow foundational is to implicitly make a philosophic claim that is the metaphysical primary and not somehow the fundamental process that is then pointed to in quantum field theory. So I think what we have really is two fundamental metaphysical orders, the order of the actual and the order of the possible. And if you start from that framework, then we should be more open to asking, well, what is the implication of this kind of fundamental description? It can give us now a new way of understanding quantum physics and help us to reinterpret and newly understand a variety of experiments in quantum physics, including the long-distance correlations of entanglement that have been now so well established in experiment and theory, the entanglement phenomena of long-distance correlations of fundamental relations that go beyond speed of light propagation limitation, which, mind you, the speed of light limitation does apply for the correlations of space-time relations in actual data outputs, and correlating those lead us to realizing the constraints of relativity theory, and under acceleration phenomena and gravity lead to the constraints of general relativity theory. But those constraints are upon actualized sets of actualizations and their correlation. Those are not constraints necessarily upon the fundamental process when you then look in the point of view of the quantum field theory and look at the fundamental process. So then, now suppose that psi phenomena represent a mode of somehow tapping in to the potential relations of this non-Boolean possibilistic pre-space, the fundamental process, the fundamental succession of the world in context of its as a ground, so to speak, a ground for the science that arises out of it, of the quantum physics and relativity theory, but that it's, so to speak, pre-space, it's prior to that. So through making this distinction of, very fundamentally of the actual and possible, enables a new way to think about a number of issues. So I think this could affect the issue of the mind-brain relation that Ed referred to. And I certainly think it affects, well, we need to then look at the basic experiments to be evidence-based with respect to what are the possibilities for understanding psi phenomena in a new way. I imagine that one, so to speak, spiritual experience that I had involved, so to speak, a tapping in to the fundamental pre-space potentia that's just everywhere. And the experience with me was profound, but very isolated and only limited. And I think my cognitive orientation in my space physics world and the way I tend to exclude doing that, tend to suppress that. And And I think this relates to the left hemisphere, right hemisphere distinction that is so well laid out in the book, The Matter with Things, that Ian McGilchrist recently had published, completely independent of what I've done. So I think that is tapping into pre-space potentia is, at least I think, a possible way of understanding psi phenomena. Even the anticipatory capabilities of that, given all the information, could also explain quite a bit about precognition without imposing anything about some kind of block universe deterministic framework. And I think I'll conclude just to restate that these are just pointers, beginnings of an adequate theory that I think we really need to be evidence-based with respect to taking the great work that Ed Kelly and many others have done over the years to test certain phenomena, to take them seriously and not dismiss them prematurely based upon what, in many cases, have been simply an incorrect understanding, or maybe a commitment to actualism or some other scientism that is highly problematic. Thank you.